Jamal Carter rode the same bicycle to his after-school job every single day for 2 years. A bicycle with a bent front fender and a seat held together with black electrical tape. A bicycle that had belonged to his older cousin before it belonged to him, and had already been old when his cousin owned it. And Jamal did not mind the bicycle. Not really, because it got him where he needed to go, 6 days a week, from Lincoln High School to Rossi's Hardware on 5th Street, where he swept floors and stocked shelves for $9 an hour. Money he handed over almost entirely to his mother, Denise Carter, to help cover rent, keeping only enough for bus fare on the days it rained too hard to ride. And Jamal had learned, the way a lot of kids in his neighborhood learned early, that pride was a luxury item, something you could not always afford alongside rent and groceries. So he pedaled that ugly bicycle down 5th Street with his head up anyway, because his mother had raised him to believe that how you carried yourself mattered more than what you were carrying it on. And for 2 years, that belief had mostly held, until one Thursday afternoon in September, when Jamal was locking his bicycle to the rack outside Rossi's Hardware, and a patrol car pulled up along the curb, and Officer Gary Hutchins stepped out, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s who had walked that beat for almost 20 years, and who considered himself, in the particular way certain officers do, a good judge of character, someone who could tell at a glance who belonged somewhere and who did not. And Officer Hutchins looked at Jamal locking up the bicycle, looked at the bent fender and the taped seat and the rust creeping along the chain, and he said, loud enough for the 2 women waiting at the bus stop to hear, "Well, would you look at that, son? Did you steal that thing from a junkyard, or did it just crawl out of one on its own?" And Jamal, who had heard plenty of comments about the bike before, from classmates, from strangers, comments he had trained himself to absorb without reaction, felt something different in the way Officer Hutchins said it, something with an edge underneath the joke, and he said quietly, "No, sir, it's mine." And Officer Hutchins laughed, a short, humorless laugh, and said, "I bet it is." And then, in a tone that shifted from mockery into something closer to accusation, he asked Jamal for identification. Right there on the sidewalk, in front of the 2 women at the bus stop, and the customers walking in and out of Rossi's front door, and Jamal, who had done nothing except lock up a bicycle outside the store where he worked, felt his stomach drop the particular way it drops when you understand you are being treated as a suspect for the crime of existing somewhere while poor. And he handed over his student identification card with hands that were not quite steady, and Officer Hutchins looked at it for a long moment, longer than necessary, turning it over as though checking for a forgery, and then handed it back and said, "All right, go on then. But I'll be keeping an eye on that bike. Things like that have a way of turning up reported stolen." And he got back into his patrol car and drove off, leaving Jamal standing on the sidewalk with his identification card in his hand, and his face burning with a shame that had nowhere to go, because there was no crime to be angry about, only a series of small, deliberate cruelties wrapped in the language of doing his job. And Jamal did not tell his mother that night, because his mother worked double shifts at the hospital laundry facility and came home too tired most nights to carry one more worry. And he especially did not tell his older sister, because his older sister was the one person in the family who Jamal was certain would not let it go. And that certainty was rooted in something Jamal knew, but had not fully processed the size of yet, which was that his sister, Renee Carter, had joined the police academy 4 years earlier, not because their family had any particular love for the department, but because Renee had grown up watching officers like Hutchins treat their neighborhood like a place to be managed rather than served. And she had decided at 19 years old, against the wishes of nearly everyone she knew, that the only way she was ever going to change that from the inside was to become exactly what she resented. So she went through the academy, graduated near the top of her class, and spent 4 years working her way through patrol assignments with a discipline and a fairness that had, slowly, earned her a reputation among both colleagues and the community as someone who did the job the way it was supposed to be done. And in the months before that Thursday on 5th Street, Renee had been promoted twice in quick succession, first to sergeant, and then, remarkably fast for someone her age, into a newly created position as Captain of Community Standards and Internal Review, a role the department had created under pressure from a city council increasingly concerned about complaints against officers that seemed to disappear into paperwork without consequence. And Renee's job, specifically, was to review those complaints, all of them, including ones filed years earlier and never fully resolved, and cross-reference them against officer conduct patterns to identify problems the department had been quietly ignoring. And Jamal knew his sister had been promoted. He had gone to the small ceremony at the precinct and watched her pin go on with a pride that made his chest ache. But he did not fully understand yet what her new job actually meant in practice. Did not understand that somewhere in a filing system Renee now had access to, there existed a folder with Officer Gary Hutchins's name on it, a folder that was thicker than most, containing 11 prior complaints filed over 19 years. Complaints about unnecessary stops, about comments made to residents, about a pattern so consistent that if anyone had ever bothered to lay the complaints side by side, the shape of the problem would have been impossible to miss. And for 2 weeks after the incident outside Rossi's Hardware, Jamal carried the memory quietly, the way he had learned to carry most difficult things, going to work, riding the same bicycle because it was still the only bicycle he had, and he refused to let one man's cruelty take even that from him, though he did start locking it around the side of the building instead of the front rack, a small concession to fear that he hated making, but made anyway, and it might have stayed a private wound indefinitely, except that, on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks later, Jamal's manager at the hardware store, an older man named Frank Rossi, who had owned the shop for 30 years and who liked Jamal enormously for his work ethic, mentioned, almost in passing while restocking paint cans, that he'd noticed Jamal moving his bike to the side of the building and asked if everything was all right. And Jamal, caught off guard by the direct question from someone he trusted, found himself telling Frank the whole story, the identification check, the comment about the junkyard, the threat about reporting it stolen, and Frank Rossi, who had watched plenty of officers walk in and out of his store over 30 years, and who had strong opinions about the difference between the ones who served the neighborhood and the ones who merely patrolled it, listened with a tightening jaw, and then said, "Jamal, you need to report this. Formally. Not just tell me about it." And Jamal said what he had been thinking for 2 weeks, that reporting an officer felt like shouting into a hole, that nothing ever came of complaints like that. People in his neighborhood had been saying it for years, and Frank Rossi, who happened to know a few things about the department's recent changes because his brother-in-law worked in the city clerk's office, told Jamal something that made him go very still. He told him that the department had just created a new internal review position, specifically because the old system of complaints disappearing into nothing had become a public embarrassment, and that the officer running that new position, Frank said, was a young captain who had come up through patrol herself and had a reputation for actually reading every single file that crossed her desk. And Frank did not know Renee Carter's name, had no idea of the connection sitting right in front of him. He simply encouraged Jamal to file the complaint through the department's new online portal rather than the old paper system that everyone knew got buried. And Jamal, sitting in the back office of the hardware store on his lunch break, opened the portal on his phone, still not entirely believing it would matter, and began filling out the form. And it was only when the form asked him to select the reviewing division from a drop-down menu that he saw it, Office of Community Standards and Internal Review. And below it, in smaller text, the name of the captain currently assigned to that division, Captain R. Carter. And Jamal stared at his own phone screen in the back office of a hardware store for a long moment because he had known, in the abstract, distant way. You know a fact about a family member's job without ever expecting it to intersect with your own life. That his sister worked somewhere in the building where complaints like this went. But he had never imagined that the complaint he was about to file would land directly on her desk, and something about that realization changed the entire feeling of filling out the form. It stopped feeling like shouting into a hole and started feeling like something real. And Jamal finished the complaint that afternoon, describing the incident in careful, factual detail. The date, the time, the officer's badge number, which he had noted, without quite realizing why at the time, the exact words used, and he submitted it. And then, because he was still not ready to have a direct conversation about it, he did not tell Renee himself. He simply let the system carry the report to her the way it was designed to. And 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, Renee Carter sat at her desk in the Office of Community Standards and Internal Review, working through the week's new complaint submissions the way she did every morning, reading each one carefully regardless of how minor it seemed, because she had promised herself when she took this job that she would never be the kind of reviewer who skimmed. And she opened a new submission, Complainant Jamal Carter, and for one full second, her brain did not process what she was looking at. Because seeing her own brother's name attached to a formal complaint against a police officer was so far outside anything she had prepared herself for that she genuinely thought, for a moment, it might be a different Jamal Carter, a coincidence of names. But as she read further, the details made it unmistakable. The mention of Rossi's hardware, the description of the bicycle, the exact build and mannerisms that could only be her little brother. And Renee sat at her desk and read the complaint twice, then a third time, and felt something inside her go cold, and then very, very focused, because she recognized, immediately, the officer's badge number listed in the report. She recognized it because Gary Hutchins's file was one of the first files she had pulled when she started this position 4 months earlier. One of the thickest files in the entire division. And she had already flagged him internally as a priority case, had already begun quietly building a pattern analysis of his 11 prior complaints, had already started to suspect that this was exactly the kind of case her new position had been created to finally address. And now, here was a 12th complaint, and it was her own brother's name attached to it. And Renee understood immediately that this created a serious problem of process, because a captain reviewing a complaint filed by her own sibling was a conflict of interest so obvious that if she simply proceeded normally, any resulting discipline could be challenged and potentially thrown out entirely on the grounds of personal bias. And Renee, who had spent 4 years building a reputation specifically for doing things by the book, even when it cost her something, made a decision in that moment that would matter enormously to how the rest of the story unfolded. She did not review the complaint herself. She picked up her phone and called her direct supervisor, Deputy Chief Miriam Alvarez, and told her plainly that a new complaint had come in against an officer already under pattern review, and that the complainant was her own brother, and that she needed to recuse herself immediately and have the case reassigned to another reviewer to protect the integrity of the process. And Deputy Chief Alvarez, who valued exactly this kind of transparency, agreed immediately and assigned the complaint, along with the existing pattern file on Hutchins, to a senior reviewer named Thomas Reyes, a 22-year veteran of internal affairs known throughout the department for being difficult to argue with once he had made up his mind. And only after making that call, only after ensuring the process would be clean and unimpeachable, did Renee finally call her brother, not as a captain, but simply as his sister. And when Jamal picked up and heard her voice, tight and careful in a way he had never quite heard before, he knew immediately that she had seen the complaint, and she asked him, gently, why he had not told her himself. And Jamal, sitting on the edge of his bed, with the ugly old bicycle leaning against the wall beside him, told her everything. the identification check, the comment, the 2 weeks of silence. And Renee listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she said, "I am so sorry that happened to you, and I am so sorry you carried it alone." And then she told him what she had done, recusing herself, sending it to Thomas Reyes. And she told him something else too, something she had not been planning to share, but felt he deserved to know. That Hutchins already had 11 complaints in his file going back 19 years. That Jamal's report was not an isolated incident being blown out of proportion, but the 12th piece of a pattern that the department had simply never assembled into a full picture before. And Jamal sat on the edge of his bed and felt something shift inside him. A loneliness he had not fully named until it started to lift. The understanding that he had not been imagining the wrongness of what happened. That 11 other people over 19 years had felt something similar enough to also file complaints. And that finally, for the first time in 19 years, someone in a position to actually connect those 11 complaints into a pattern had done exactly that. And over the following 6 weeks, Thomas Reyes conducted a full and formal review, interviewing Jamal, interviewing the 2 women who had been waiting at the bus stop and who both independently corroborated the exact tone and content of what Hutchins had said, interviewing several of the earlier complainants going back years, some of whom had assumed their original complaints had simply vanished and were startled to be contacted again after so long. And Reyes assembled all 12 complaints into a single comprehensive report that laid out, in careful chronological detail, a pattern that no individual complaint had ever fully revealed on its own. And when the report was finished, it went before the department's disciplinary review board, and Officer Gary Hutchins, after 19 years on the force, was terminated, not for any single incident, though the incident with Jamal had been the trigger that finally pulled the full pattern into daylight, but for what the board's official finding called a sustained and repeated pattern of discriminatory conduct, inconsistent with the standards of the department, and the termination made a small amount of local news, enough that Frank Rossi read about it in the paper and came into work that Monday and told Jamal, with something like pride in his voice, that he had known filing that complaint was the right call. And Jamal, sweeping the same floors he had swept for 2 years, felt a complicated mixture of relief and something heavier, because termination did not erase the 2 years of low-grade fear that had shaped how he moved through his own neighborhood, did not erase the 11 people before him whose complaints had gone nowhere for nearly 2 decades. But it did mean that the pattern had finally been named and stopped, and that felt, if not like justice exactly, at least like the beginning of something closer to it. And Renee, watching from a careful distance because of her recusal, felt her own complicated mixture of feelings, pride in the system finally working the way it was supposed to, frustration that it had taken her own brother's humiliation to surface a pattern that 11 other complaints should have surfaced years earlier, and a renewed, sharpened sense of purpose about the work still ahead of her, because she understood, sitting in her office reviewing the next week's new complaints, that Hutchins wasn't the only file in her division thick with unresolved history, and that the real work of her new position wasn't going to be finished with one termination. It was going to be the slow, unglamorous work of reading every file carefully, cross-referencing every pattern, and refusing, case after case, to let complaints disappear the way they always had before. And a few weeks after the termination, Jamal came home from his shift at Rossi's and found a small box waiting for him on the kitchen table, and inside it was a new bicycle, not expensive, but solid and well-built, with no bent fender and no taped seat, and a note in his mother's handwriting that simply said, "You earned this the hard way." And Jamal rode that new bicycle to work the next day, taking the same route down 5th Street, past the same corner where a patrol car had once pulled up beside him, and he found that he did not flinch this time when a different patrol car passed, driven by an officer he did not recognize because something in him had settled. Not fully, not completely. Some wariness would probably stay with him for a long time, but enough that he could ride down that street with his head up, the way his mother had always told him to, not because the world had become perfectly fair, but because for once, in one specific instance, someone with the power to make a difference had actually chosen to use it, and that someone had been his own sister. And 8 months later, at a community town hall the department held to discuss its new complaint review process, Renee Carter stood up in front of a room full of residents, many of whom had spent years believing complaints against officers vanished into nothing. And she told them, without ever using Jamal's name or Hutchins's name specifically out of respect for the formal process, that the department had implemented a new pattern tracking system directly as a result of lessons learned that year, a system that would ensure no complaint, however small it seemed on its own, would ever again sit isolated and forgotten in a file cabinet while a pattern grew invisible around it. And in the back of that room, sitting quietly beside his mother, Jamal Carter listened to his sister speak with a pride that had finally, fully replaced the shame he had once carried alone on a bicycle with a bent fender, understanding that the two of them, in their very different ways, one by having the courage to file a report he did not believe would matter, and one by having the discipline to recuse herself and let the process work honestly, even when it would have been so much easier to simply intervene as a sister, had together become part of something larger than either of them, a small, specific correction in a system that badly needed more of them. And there is more to this story that unfolded in the months that followed. Details that never made the local news article, but that mattered enormously to the people living inside them, because the 12th complaint, the one Jamal filed, did not simply close a single file. It opened a door onto a much larger and more uncomfortable set of questions about how the department had operated for 2 decades. Because when Thomas Reyes assembled his comprehensive report on Hutchins, he discovered something that troubled him even more than the pattern itself. He discovered that at least 4 of the 11 prior complaints had been reviewed, at the time, by supervisors who had simply closed them as unsubstantiated without ever interviewing witnesses or cross-referencing them against Hutchins's other files. And 2 of those supervisors were still active officers within the department, one of them now holding a senior training role responsible for mentoring new recruits. And this discovery forced Renee's division, and eventually Deputy Chief Alvarez herself, into a much larger reckoning than anyone had anticipated when Jamal first filed his complaint on his lunch break at the hardware store. Because it was no longer simply a question of one officer's conduct, it became a question of how many other patterns across the department had been quietly closed without proper review over the years. And Deputy Chief Alvarez, to her credit, did not try to minimize what Reyes had uncovered. She ordered a full audit of every complaint filed against any officer in the department over the previous 10 years, a project that took Renee's small division the better part of a year to complete, working evenings and weekends, cross-referencing thousands of individual reports against officer names, badge numbers, and outcomes. And that audit eventually surfaced 6 additional cases where patterns similar to Hutchins's had gone unexamined, though none quite as severe. And each of those cases moved through its own formal review process, and Renee found herself, over that year, becoming something she had not fully expected to become when she joined the academy at 19. Not simply a good officer doing an honest job, but one of the primary architects of a genuinely new system inside a department that badly needed one. And this work came with costs that were rarely discussed publicly, because not everyone inside the department welcomed the audit. Several older officers, including some who had worked alongside Hutchins for years, made their resentment known in quieter ways. Cold silences in the break room, comments about certain people getting ahead by making trouble. And Renee absorbed this the way she had learned to absorb most difficult things in her career, without letting it change the thoroughness of her work. though she did, on more than one evening that year, come home to the small apartment she shared with her college roommate and sit quietly on the couch for a long while before she could bring herself to talk about her day. And it was Jamal, of all people, who noticed this most clearly, because the two of them had grown closer in the months following the complaint, meeting for dinner every other week at a small diner near the precinct, and Jamal, watching his sister carry the weight of an entire department's reckoning on her shoulders, found himself in the unusual position of being the one offering steadiness to the sister who had once been the one steadying him. And he told her, one evening over plates of eggs and toast, that he understood now something he had not fully understood before. That doing the right thing rarely felt like the triumphant, satisfying moment it looked like from the outside. It usually felt like exhausting, unglamorous work that made people uncomfortable and that nobody thanked you for in the moment. And Renee, hearing her younger brother articulate something she had been struggling to put into words herself, felt a wave of pride so strong it surprised her, because she realized that whatever he had lost in 2 years of quietly enduring small cruelties on that bicycle, he had gained a kind of clarity about the world that many people twice his age never developed. And meanwhile, Jamal's own life had continued moving forward in its own smaller, steadier way, because Frank Rossi, watching how Jamal had handled the entire situation with a composure well beyond his years, offered him an increase in hours and, eventually, a small raise, telling him plainly that he wanted to keep an employee with that kind of integrity around for as long as possible. And Jamal used part of that additional money to start a small savings account, specifically earmarked for community college. An idea that had felt distant and unlikely to him before that year, but that now felt, for the first time, genuinely reachable. And he continued riding his new bicycle down 5th Street every day. And slowly, over months, he noticed something else changing in the neighborhood itself, because word of what had happened filtered through the community the way news always does, informally, through conversations at the barbershop and the corner store and the church, and several other young people in the neighborhood, kids who had also experienced small humiliations at the hands of officers over the years, and had assumed, like Jamal once had, that reporting them was pointless, began quietly filing their own complaints through the new online portal, emboldened by knowing that this time there was a real person on the other end actually reading them. And Renee's division, though still small, began handling a steadily increasing volume of reports, not because problems were suddenly increasing, but because people were finally beginning to trust that reporting them might actually matter. And this shift, gradual and largely invisible to anyone outside the neighborhood, represented perhaps the truest measure of what had changed. Not a single dramatic termination, but a slow rebuilding of a kind of trust that had been eroded over 19 years and could only be rebuilt. Renee came to understand, one honestly handled complaint at a time, and a year after the town hall where Renee had spoken without naming names, the department held a smaller, quieter ceremony to mark the 1-year anniversary of the new pattern tracking system, and this time, Deputy Chief Alvarez specifically asked Renee to speak. And Renee, standing at a podium in front of a room of officers and a handful of community members, found herself thinking not about statistics or policy language, but about a bent front fender and a piece of black electrical tape holding a bicycle seat together. And though she still did not use her brother's name publicly, she allowed herself, for the first time, to say one true thing that had been sitting in her chest for over a year. She said that the most important lesson she had learned in this role was not about policy or procedure, though those mattered enormously. It was that behind every complaint number and every case file was a real person who had decided, often against every instinct telling them it would not matter, to speak up anyway, and that the department's only real job, the only job that mattered, was to prove that instinct wrong every single time someone found the courage to try. and in the audience that evening, sitting quietly near the back beside his mother, Jamal Carter listened to his sister speak those words and felt, for perhaps the final time in this particular chapter of his life, the last remaining traces of shame from that Thursday afternoon on 5th Street, finally, completely, dissolve, replaced by something sturdier, a quiet understanding that he had not simply survived a humiliating moment. He had, in his own small and uncertain way, helped change something much larger than himself, and riding home that night on his new bicycle, past the same corner where it had all begun, Jamal found that the street looked exactly the same as it always had. The same cracked sidewalk, the same flickering streetlight outside Rossi's Hardware, and yet it felt entirely different beneath him, not because anything visible had changed, but because he understood now, in a way he had not understood 2 years earlier, that the ground beneath a neighborhood can shift quietly and permanently, even when nothing on the surface looks any different at all. One honest report, one careful sister, one long overdue reckoning at a time. And there is one last piece of this story worth telling, because 2 years after that Thursday afternoon on 5th Street, Jamal Carter, having saved enough from his hours at Rossi's Hardware and a small scholarship the community college offered to local students with strong work histories, enrolled in an introductory criminal justice course, not because he had decided he wanted to become an officer himself. That question still felt too large and too complicated for him to answer with any certainty, but because he had become genuinely curious in the aftermath of everything that happened, about how systems like the one his sister worked inside actually functioned, how a single complaint could sit ignored for years and then suddenly matter, how a department could contain both a man like Hutchins and a woman like Renee at the very same time. And on the first day of that class, the professor, a former public defender named Ms. Okafor, asked each student to share, briefly, why they had chosen to take the course. And when it came to Jamal's turn, he found himself telling a shortened version of the story. The bicycle, the officer, his sister, the complaint, and the room, full of strangers who had never heard any of it before, went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it recognizes something true. And after class, 3 different students approached him separately, each with their own version of a similar story. A family member stopped without cause, a complaint that went nowhere, a small injustice absorbed silently because speaking up had never once seemed worth the risk. And Jamal realized, walking back to where he had locked his bicycle outside the community college building, that his story was not really unusual at all, that it was, if anything, remarkably common. The only unusual part had been what happened after. The fact that somewhere in the chain between his complaint and its resolution had stood one person willing to actually follow it all the way through. And he understood then, more clearly than he ever had before, exactly what his sister had meant that evening at the podium. That the system's only real job was to prove people's instinct to stay silent wrong every single time, and riding home that afternoon, past Rossi's Hardware, where Frank still waved at him through the front window every day, past the corner where a patrol car had once pulled up beside him, Jamal Carter understood that he was no longer simply the boy who had once been humiliated for the crime of riding an old bicycle. He had become, slowly, and without ever fully intending it, living proof of what happens when one person's fear finally loses out to one person's courage. And that, more than any single ceremony or termination or news article, was the ending. This story had been quietly building toward all along, not a moment of dramatic reversal witnessed by a crowded room, but a young man riding steadily down a familiar street, no longer flinching, finally, fully, at home in his own life, and looking back on it all later. Denise Carter, the mother who had worked double shifts at the hospital laundry facility for years to keep her 2 children fed and housed, would sometimes tell people, when the story came up among friends or at church gatherings, that she had raised her son and her daughter to believe two very different but equally important things. She had raised Jamal to believe that dignity did not depend on what you owned or how new your bicycle looked. And she had raised Renee to believe that real power was only worth having if you used it honestly, even when honesty cost you something. And she said that she had never imagined, on the long nights she came home exhausted from the laundry facility and found her children already asleep, that those two lessons, planted separately in two different children over two different childhoods, would one day meet each other in a single police department's filing system and quietly change the way an entire community understood whether speaking up was worth the risk. And Denise kept a small photograph on her refrigerator from the town hall ceremony, a photograph of Renee at the podium and Jamal sitting quietly in the audience beside her. And she said that whenever she looked at it, she did not see a policy success story or a news headline. She simply saw two children who had grown into exactly the kind of adults she had always hoped they would become. One brave enough to speak when speaking felt pointless, and one honest enough to listen when listening was the harder and less glamorous choice. And that, she said, was worth more to her than any promotion or any ceremony the department could ever offer either of them. And even Frank Rossi, who had spent 30 years watching young employees come and go through his hardware store, would sometimes tell customers, when Jamal was out of earshot restocking shelves, that he considered that Thursday afternoon on 5th Street one of the strangest blessings his little store had ever quietly witnessed, because he said most people spend their whole lives waiting for a single dramatic moment to prove who they really are, and most people never actually get that moment. But every once in a while, Frank said, life hands somebody exactly the wrong day at exactly the wrong time. And somehow, through nothing more than a boy's quiet decision to finally speak up, and a sister's stubborn insistence on doing things the right way, even when the easy way sat right there in front of her, that wrong day turns, slowly and unglamorously, into the beginning of something a whole neighborhood needed, far more than anyone involved ever fully understood at the time.